We're here in 2023. What was happening 80 years ago in the world? It was 1943, and the world was steeped in war. It was World War II, the most bloody war ever fought on the planet. Millions, tens of millions died. What was happening 80 years prior to that was 1863. For Americans, that should sound like a familiar date, especially ones who had family members here in this country many generations ago. That was the American Civil War. The American Civil War was right at its apex in 1863. 80 years prior to that, 1783, was nearing the end of the American Revolution. Every 80 years, we found ourselves in a huge conflict. And here we are on the verge of another major conflict. Is it going to be World War III against Russia and China? Or is it going to be American Civil War 2.0? Nobody really knows for sure, but it certainly looks like big things are about to happen on the world stage. It really looks like things are going to happen with finances. Looks like we may be on the verge of a financial reset. And while every expert tells you with certainty they know what's going to happen, of course, nobody knows. Nobody knows whether we're going to reset and go along with central bank digital currencies, or whether the BRICS nations are going to take over and the de-dollarization will happen and the US dollar will lose its value rapidly, or something out of left field might happen. But all we know is that huge change is upon us right now. And a lot of that I knew was coming because of this book. This is an outstanding book. The Fourth Turning. William Strauss and Neil Howe. This was written in 1997, I believe it was printed for the first time. I first heard about it from a preacher named Cy Rogers. He was living as a homosexual and about to change his gender. And then the Lord took hold of his life and he changed. He married a woman. They had kids. I believe he is deceased now, but it was actually at a women's conference that I was serving at, and he mentioned this book and what it was all about, and it totally fascinated me. And so I looked into it, and it was years later that I actually found the book, bought it, and read it from cover to cover. I was actually reading it in March of 2020, which there was actually a line in the book that said, I believe, and don't quote me on this, it's not verbatim, around the year 2020, we will see new diseases. It also said there'd be war and other upheavals, but it specifically said a new disease around 2020. Now, whether you believe that whole thing that happened in 2020 was planned or not, is kind of beside the point. He's just recognizing patterns, and I also find it, beyond coincidence that the Spanish flu happened exactly 100 years earlier than the events of March 2020. But anyway, without putting on your tinfoil hats too tightly, I really think this book is telling us that these changes aren't done. We will know they're done when something absolutely cataclysmic happens in our world. And it's going to happen. It may not happen tomorrow. It may not even happen this year or next year, but it's going to happen in this decade. I can pretty much guarantee it. One of the authors, Neil Howe, has just published another book called The Fourth Turning is Here. And if you're unfamiliar with the concept, it's that, well, I've already demonstrated those 80-year cycles. And I mean, it's really pretty close to clockwork. I mean, the starting and ending dates were a little different. But in every case, after the crisis period, which in that first American crisis period was the Revolution, immediately after that, there's a high. Probably more familiar to most people nowadays was the American high of the 1950s. And that continued until the day JFK was assassinated. And then the high became an awakening, right? And then that happens for roughly 20 years. And then the awakening becomes an unraveling for roughly 20 years. And then the unraveling gives way to a crisis period, which lasts about 20 years. And we're right at the crisis period. And within the crisis, of course, is the climax of the crisis, which in each of these past turnings, each of these past 80-year cycles, was a major war that involved everyone to some degree. Of course, not everyone was on the front lines, but women were involved in factories, World War II, creating ammunition, and lots of different support roles. And we're looking to move into something like that again, and I think it's right around the corner. As well as there being 20-year periods that mark different processes that are going through the citizens of a given country. And this is applicable to all civilizations throughout history and to all countries. But of course, I'm focusing on United States history and what we've been through over the past 3 80-year cycles. But within each of those 80-year cycles is 4 generations, roughly 20 years each. Of course, I'm a late Gen Xer. My wife and I are both in the tail end of what would be considered Gen X, but we did both have that type of upbringing where we were like latchkey kids. You'd come home, nobody'd be home, or in my case, my parents were both, my mother was ill, my father was working, so basically the TV raised us. And that's what Gen Xers were known for. It was during a time when experts were telling parents, oh, don't put your kids on a pedestal. Don't focus on them too much. Just let them, we'd run around, we'd get on our dirt bikes. My friends and I would make jumps and we'd come back, we'd be all scraped up and bruised and bloody. And it was okay because that's the way we grew up. Nowadays, parents are way more overprotective and kids don't go out as much. They stay inside and, play on their phones and video games. And we loved video games too back in the 80s and 90s, but we definitely got outside and got into mischief a little bit more than I think these generations after us are used to. But the Gen Xers are the nomad archetype. And of course, I've lived in 5 different US states. I'll get into that in some other video and talk about all the differences between all the states that I've lived in and all the different towns and cities within those states. And I've also lived truly nomadically for about 2 years. My wife and I lived in an RV with our 2 dogs and traveled the country. I've been to 40 of the 50 US states. I've been to 5 different countries. My wife is at least as well as traveled as I am. And so we strongly identify with that nomad archetype. There's also the hero archetype, which were the greatest generation that fought World War II. And that's also supposedly the millennials are going to be the hero generation for this turning. And then there's the artist archetype, which was the baby boomers. And there's also I believe it was called the prophet archetype, which would have been the silent generation. And anyway, I strongly encourage you, check this book out. I'm definitely going to get the 4th Turning is Here by Neil Howe, read it, and I'm going to let you guys know what I'm getting out of it. And I think what's happening in the book is undeniable. Whether you have a Christian worldview or, you don't believe that there's any kind of higher force with his hand on things, whether you believe it's secret societies behind the scenes pulling puppet strings or some kind of, extraterrestrial force that's overseeing all of these events. I do believe that this 80-year cycle is just about undeniable. And it does make sense because after 80 years has come and gone, very few of the people who went through the previous crisis are still around. And if they are around, they're very old. So there's some very interesting stories that you can hear from, like Holocaust survivors that are still around. And of course, they're in their 90s probably, if they were old enough to remember any of the events that they went through during that time period. And we're about to go through our own thing, whatever that may be. I've always been someone who believed I was gonna see a time of great upheaval in my lifetime. I used to believe when I was younger that I would definitely see the return of Jesus Christ, and we may still. I definitely don't believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, but that's another video for another day. The crisis period is also marked by being the time when people have the least amount of faith in institutions. And that goes for all institutions. The education system, the banking system, government, military, everything. People are lacking faith in those things during this period. And that has always been the case. We don't necessarily think of people having, obviously there were differences of opinion in the American Revolution, in the American Civil War, in World War II. People had very different ideologies that were clashing. And that's the period when it comes to a head. It can no longer, we can no longer just agree to disagree. We have to, something has to give. It's when the immovable object meets the irresistible force. And something huge changes in our world. And I really don't think the events of 2020, 2021, with that that sickness that came around, I don't think that was it. I definitely think we're going to see something absolutely monumental happen with the monetary system in this decade, probably sooner than later. And I think we're going to see another world war. I think it was always meant to be a trilogy. And we're there. It's time. There's lots of signs in the sun, moon, and stars. There's signs from people who study history and economics. We're about to enter a period of incredible change. Whether it starts tomorrow, whether it starts 2 weeks from now, 2 more weeks, right? Or whether it's still a couple years out, something's going to happen. And it's pretty much undeniable. This book will make you realize that. And there's a few other books I want to talk to you guys about, but those are other videos for other days. So for now, this is McRaj. Hoping I've given you something to think about. If it's something you haven't thought about before, there are tons of other videos out there on YouTube. I know a lot of alternative media folks know about this book and have talked about it. Tim Pool, Marfoogle News, a lot of those guys bring it up and talk about how it's relevant. So lots more out there for you to watch in YouTube land if you're not wanting to actually buy the book and read it cover to cover. There were definitely a few chapters that were weaker than others, but absolutely outstanding in terms of the concepts in the book. So, this is McRaj, signing off.